Just going to put my phone on so we don't go over. So it's 11:30. This is a 30-minute window, and I'm going to try and do a 20-minute talk and leave 10 minutes for questions at the end. So yes, please be ready to have some questions. If not, we can just have a nice discussion at the end as well. So again, my talk today is on ocean deoxygenation, the climate impact we aren't considering, and its impacts on marine communities and fisheries. And just for a show of hands, how many people have heard about ocean deoxygenation prior to this talk? Okay, that's really excellent. My first COP was in Poland, and we interviewed people in the hallway over and over and over and over again and couldn't find a single person who had heard of ocean deoxygenation. So that's really promising to see in 4 years, and maybe another 4 years, everybody will raise their hand. So just a very brief introduction to oxygen. We can appreciate why it means a lot for animals in the ocean if we can appreciate what it means to us first. So as humans, we breathe oxygen and we exhale carbon dioxide. And the oxygen is very necessary because every single one of our cells, all of our tissues, all of our muscles require oxygen to produce energy. In the air, oxygen is quite abundant. So there's 21% composition of oxygen in the air we breathe. So oxygen, I would say, is the most important molecule for aerobic life. And aerobic life is everything that breathes. You'll die without oxygen much faster than without water, without food. So it's really integral to how we function. It's very integral to our physiology. And the same goes for all of the marine critters in the ocean. A little difference is that instead of breathing through lungs like us, fish breathe using their gills. But the same thing, they take in oxygen, they produce carbon dioxide. One of the really important properties of water is that it has much less oxygen in it than air does, actually 30 times less. So at the surface, if the oxygen in air is if the air and the water is fully equilibrated, the water still only has 1/30th of the oxygen molecules per the same amount of volume that the air does. So for a fish, that means that if it wants to take in the same amount of oxygen, it needs to pump 30 times more volume of water over its gills, which is a lot of work. So already, animals in the ocean are always dealing with this difficulty of extracting oxygen. So how does oxygen get into the ocean? So there are some very important mixing processes that actually mix oxygen from the atmosphere into the ocean. Those are things like waves, and then also phytoplankton produce oxygen. Phytoplankton actually contribute 50% of the oxygen to the atmosphere that we breathe. So those are the two main mechanisms, mixing in from the atmosphere and phytoplankton production. And those all take place within the surface ocean. Everything in the deep ocean is reliant on those surface processes occurring in a beneficial way. And again, ocean deoxygenation is the loss of oxygen from the oceans due to climate change. So why does ocean warming lead to oxygen loss? We know that the ocean has played a tremendous role as a climate mitigator. It's taken up over 90% of the excess heat in the climate system, and it's taken up almost 1/3 of the carbon dioxide emissions that we produce. So as the ocean warms, though, its ability to hold oxygen decreases. You know that if you warm a soda and then you open it, it bubbles a lot more, and that's because the water is actually releasing that gas. Same thing is happening in the ocean as temperatures increase. Also, as the ocean warms at the surface, it takes more energy to mix it. So if you see here a cold ocean, it's actually easier to mix with winds, whereas a warm ocean, you only get mixing in that top surface layer. And again, as I mentioned, all of that deep ocean is reliant on processes that happen at the surface. That's when the oxygen concentration is really formed, and everything else goes into the deep ocean afterwards. So it's really important that these surface processes allow us to have high concentrations of oxygen. Different things contribute to stratification. That means that difficulty of mixing. So surface warming also changes in salinity. So fresh water makes it more difficult for that water to get mixed down, and also decreased wind strength. So we have both models and measurements show us that oxygen levels in the ocean are changing. This right here is the result of 10 Earth system model runs, which look at how oxygen declines in the ocean at intermediate depths across different representative concentration pathway scenarios. So looking at RCP 2.6, which is the high ambition scenario, as well as RCP 8.5, which is kind of our business as usual scenario. And here in these two plots, you can see on the left, that's our high ambition scenario. We still see decreases in oxygen by 2100, but they're much more minor. And then all of the orange colors are decreases in oxygen. However, for the business as usual scenario, we see really strong decreases in oxygen in the North Pacific, as well as parts of the North Atlantic and near the Arctic. So ocean deoxygenation is a result of a supply and a demand mismatch. So we've just talked about some of those really important drivers that mix oxygen into the ocean. So oxygen levels decrease as the ocean warms, as it holds less oxygen, and as less oxygen is able to get mixed in. But also, oxygen demand actually increases in a warmer ocean. And that's what we've seen from some of these really important global measurements. So this top plot, so for reference, everything that's in blue is a decrease, and everything that's in red is an increase on both of these plots, both of these maps. And what we see in the top map, that's apparent oxygen utilization. So that's how much oxygen is being used by animals and bacteria in the water. What we've seen over these 50-year period of measurements is this oxygen use, especially in the tropics and the subtropics, has increased. In the bottom map, what we see, that's the change in oxygen concentration in those waters over that same time period. So those same areas where we're seeing increased oxygen use, we're seeing decreased oxygen levels. So again, we're getting less oxygen into the water, and we're getting more use of that oxygen. And that's really driving this global problem of ocean deoxygenation with warming. We've also seen these changes regionally. Time series are extremely important for us to study changes in oxygen, and time series have shown us that this oxygen is decreasing both in the North Pacific, in Oregon, and the Southern California Bight, where I study, and off of British Columbia. So these are large-scale changes that are pretty well documented now. However, one of the really important questions that relates to oxygen, one of the reasons why it hasn't gotten focused on as much so far, is because it's very difficult to separate the anthropogenic signal of ocean deoxygenation from the natural variability of oxygen. Because so many things in the ocean breathe, and because oxygen varies with things like weather patterns and things like solubility, mixing, there's a lot of natural variation that occurs with patterns like El Niño Southern Oscillation. And so it's really difficult to say, okay, are these oxygen changes that we're seeing due to climate change, or maybe just the broader North Pacific? It's going to take until about 2030 before we can really see that anthropogenic signal emerge. And that's because the North Pacific has large, long modes of variability that are natural that influence oxygen levels. When the study was published, a lot of the media covered it. And it's very important to understand that this study does not say that the oceans will be devoid of oxygen by 2030. What it's saying is that we will see a widespread deoxygenation signal from climate change by 2030 that we can say confidently is being driven by climate change. Also, one of the really important points from this study is that we need long time series in order to really see these changes that are being driven by climate change. So here in years is the length of time series required to really be able to separate natural variability from anthropogenic variability. And so here, for example, in the Pacific, you might need 35 to 40-year time series, where in other places like the South Atlantic, you might need much longer time series. And this is one of the reasons why ocean deoxygenation hasn't been focused on so much, because we really need these long time series to look at these changes. But it's very important to study these changes because deoxygenation affects nearly all biogeochemical and biological processes in the ocean. Oxygen is very central to how things work in the ocean. and also how things work on land. Changes in oxygen influence the body size of animals, the taxonomic composition, the biodiversity, and the distributions of animals. Also, there are changes to function. For example, animal physiology is very reliant on oxygen, how animals breathe. And of course, how animals live is integral to how they interact in the food web around them. Also, recruitment, foraging behavior, these behaviors that animals have respond to changes in oxygen. And the ocean provides us with many ecosystem services. Ocean oxygen loss also influences those. Fisheries are sensitive to changes in oxygen, even things like carbon sequestration are. And animal oxygen interacts with the tolerances animals have to differences in temperature and pH as well. So here, this actually shows that we've got temperature and we've got oxygen, and we've talked about the solubility portion of this. So as temperatures increase, the ability of water to hold oxygen decreases, right? But here, we actually see that the lethal zone for animals increases as temperatures increase. So what this is showing is that the water becomes less better able to hold oxygen, and now the organisms really require more oxygen in order to survive in those environments. So it's really kind of this double whammy for animals that are living under these conditions, both warmer and lower in oxygen. So here are just some of the changes we've already seen in terms of how animals are influenced by differences in oxygen. So here, for example, we have two studies which have looked at how the diving depths of different animals differ depending on the oxygen environment. So blue marlin are very important fish. They're very aerobically active as well. And so since they're so fast, they need high oxygen environments. And what they do is they dive to deep depths for their prey. However, in areas where oxygen levels are naturally low, they actually change how deep they dive. So it's a little difficult to see, but right here, this is where they're diving. And where oxygen is higher, they dive much deeper. Where oxygen is lower, they're basically all at the surface. So their habitat gets compressed. As a result, they're much easier to catch. So it might look like the fisheries are doing better. But that's actually a population that's really susceptible to overfishing, because they're just compacted that way because they can't use their full environment anymore. Also, we see that on a global scale, there are millions of tiny animals that occupy the pelagic, so the water column. And these are incredibly important for transporting carbon out of the surface of the ocean down to the bottom. And we need that. That's a really important carbon sequestration process that the ocean provides, pumping this excess carbon down. And the animals that live in the midwater are very important to that carbon pumping. So all of these midwater fish are actually very sensitive to changes in oxygen. And we see that on a global scale, oxygen is the single best predictor of migration depth. So if oxygen levels are low in the midwater, those fish don't dive deep anymore, and they're not able to take that carbon all the way down. Also, we see across the board for different groups of animals, different sizes of animals, decreases in biodiversity that are attributed to decreasing oxygen levels. We just conducted a review where we looked at how demersal fish communities, those bottom fish communities, change as a result of oxygen gradients. So there are some parts of the ocean that have naturally low oxygen conditions, and we can use these as living laboratories to understand how communities might change in the future when we see lower oxygen conditions. What we see for the US West Coast, off of Namibia and off of Chile, that as oxygen levels decrease, moving here to the left, we see the total species richness of the demersal fish community decrease. And this is consistent across regions. So this is showing real sensitivity of biodiversity of demersal fish to oxygen levels. We also see this for macrofauna. So these are all of the tiny little animals that live in the sediment that provide a really important food source for these demersal fish. And we see that oxygen is the strongest driver of decreases in diversity of this tiny little animal community as well. We also see, so we've talked about the importance of this midwater fish community that's really acting to move carbon down. We also see very strong declines in the abundance of midwater fish during periods of low oxygen. So, for example, in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, we had a natural low oxygen period off of California. And again, those are those long modes of natural variability. But they allow us to look at community responses that in the future will be driven by anthropogenic deoxygenation. And what we see is that the abundance of these very important midwater fish declines and follows those oxygen concentrations. So if a future ocean is less oxygenated because of climate change, we'll also see a major decrease in the biomass of these small midwater fish, which are really important to carbon transport. Finally, we also see very important changes in species distribution, which are linked to differences in oxygen. Off of California, we've had a large expansion in the range of Humboldt squid. So as oxygen levels there have declined, these Humboldt squid, which are top predators and actually displace other species, have expanded their range. These are not animals you want to be in the water with. You don't want their range to expand. And we now think that this is actually due to a change in their prey concentration. So in the ocean, everything is really connected. So as the prey concentration moves, these animals move along with it, and they're actually adapted to living under those low oxygen conditions. We've also seen an actual change in the distribution of sea urchins. So as low oxygen waters have expanded, this sea urchin right here that lives off of our shore, this pink one, has actually expanded its range further into shallower waters. And these other sea urchins that aren't as tolerant have had to move into shallower waters. So we see across the board these changes in the distributions of animals. And I just want to correct another misperception that deoxygenation will not cause the ocean to become a dead zone. There are animals that are adapted to living under low oxygen conditions. However, the ability of the ocean to provide the ecosystem services that we rely on will be impacted. So we won't have nice aerobically active fish to catch for our fisheries. We'll have very sluggish fish that are slimy, and those aren't the ones you want to serve on your plate. There are also areas in the ocean that are more sensitive to changes in oxygen. So these upwelling areas that are circled. So if you live in, if your country borders one of these upwelling areas, for example, off of the west coast of South America, North America, off the west coast of Africa, in the Indian Ocean, these are areas that already have low oxygen waters and are much more sensitive to further declines in oxygen. So basically, your animals are already kind of living on the brink. And to understand these changes in oxygen, it's absolutely essential that we monitor oxygen. And there really hasn't been very many monitoring programs for oxygen, which is one of the reasons why, again, it hasn't been recognized as much. So coastally, one of the ways we can monitor oxygen is using moorings, such as the Del Mar buoy, which has shown that off of California, in midwaters, we've seen a decrease of oxygen of up to 30%, which is pretty enormous. We also see changes in oxygen from Cal Coffee, which is a really important program off of California, which for 50 years scientists and the government have interacted to measure oxygen levels and changes in the fish communities. There's also a BioArgo program, which is a global partnership of these autonomous floats that measure oxygen. So they profile the ocean going up and down, satellite communicating data back. And they provide us with a really good look at differences in oxygen in the open ocean. And also, since this is the innovation corner, I wanted to say that I'm actually working on a device to measure coastal oxygen as well with a colleague, Kevin Hardy, where we're building a small lander that can be deployed off of any small boat and has an oxygen sensor and allows you to get really good data on oxygen. It also has a camera system so you can see what the fish are doing and what the community is doing in relation to the changes in oxygen. And if you'd like to see an Argo float, please come by our booth at 30A. I think it's also really important that for a topic that, first of all, has a hard name, and second of all, hasn't been talked about very much, how do we communicate this? How do we communicate this to the public? How do we communicate this to kids? How do we make sure that deoxygenation really emerges as a part of the climate change conversation? And so one of the things we've done is we've tried to provide some teaching tools, videos. So if you'd like some videos to bring back to your country, there's one on ocean deoxygenation. So this is both available on the YouTube group Ocean Scientists as well as at booth 30A. You can pokey it, and also we've got flash drives. So just some points to remember. So warming causes ocean oxygen loss due to three main reasons: changes in solubility, changes in ventilation, and changes in oxygen utilization. So you can really think about it as an oxygen supply and demand problem. Models and measurements show declines in oxygen with climate change. So this is consistent data that climate change is going to cause ocean oxygen loss. We see that more ambitious mitigation scenarios do lead to smaller oxygen decreases. We see that deoxygenation affects nearly all biological and biogeochemical processes. So a really important driver in the ocean for thinking about how marine communities adapt to climate change. We also see that current natural gradients in oxygen allow us to think about how in the future communities will respond to changes in oxygen. And what we see is we see altered species distributions, we see habitat compression for certain species, we see decreased diving depth, biodiversity decreases, as well as decreases in this midwater fish community abundance. We know that ocean deoxygenation doesn't act alone. It's an additional stressor with ocean warming and ocean acidification, so it really impacts the ability of organisms to respond to these other stressors as well. There's a real need for more ocean oxygen observations. How can we measure and how can we understand something that we're not studying? We know that upwelling areas are more sensitive to oxygen loss, so that's a real reason for countries that have coastlines in upwelling areas to really start thinking about those impacts and making sure that your fisheries are ready to adapt to those types of changes. And so we think it's very important for countries to think about those changes and incorporate them in their national climate action plans. And we did a review of all of the submitted INDCs, and we found that only Mauritania includes oxygen loss as one of the impacts that it is working on adapting to. And with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes. Yes? Yes, absolutely. Mauritania has been an incredible leader in terms of writing oceans into its NDC. We are, like, as ocean scientists, incredibly proud of your NDC. So this is a blue marlin. A blue marlin. Yes, so this is a really important point to make, that oxygen levels in the ocean are not changing, at least not in any way that is physiologically relevant. So there's a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere and a lot less in the water, which is why those changes matter for the water. We're not seeing those changes in the atmosphere. Yes, yes. So phytoplankton do produce about 50% of the oxygen in the atmosphere. This has been produced over a long amount of time, and currently I'm not aware of any studies that are saying that oxygen in the atmosphere will be influenced by acidification or deoxygenation or phytoplankton changes in the ocean. That's certainly not something that I've seen. Yeah. Thank you for your question. Yes? If you could, introduce yourself as well.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. You said that temperature and the salinity influence the oxygen in the ocean. How does the Arctic melt might influence oxygenation?
Very good question. So when we were talking about difficulty in mixing from the ocean's warming, you can also get that same difficulty in mixing from a change in density. So when we get Arctic melt, we get a lot of fresh water at the surface. Makes it a lot more difficult to subduct that water. And so those changes in salinity patterns, an increase in fresh water, both from Arctic melt, but also maybe some changes in river output, all of those, or changes in precipitation patterns, all of those make that surface water much more difficult to mix. And so when you get a more difficult water column to mix, you get lower oxygen in the deeper water. And by deeper, we're talking like 100, 200, 300 meters, and then so on. But yeah, that's a really important question. Whenever you have a change in density between the surface and the next layer of water, then it's starting to take more energy to mix. You're getting less gas going into that water. And it's really important, like a really good way to think about the ocean, which before I became an ocean scientist, I never thought of, is that at the surface, all of the water, it kind of forms this imprint of that oxygen environment. And then later it subducts and it travels around the ocean at different depths, like on this conveyor belt, sometimes for thousands of years before it comes back up to the surface. It never gets oxygenated again during that whole time. So the parts of the ocean where you have this really old water coming up, those upwelling areas actually, are where oxygen is really low because those waters haven't seen, the light of day for sometimes thousands, 500, 1,000 years. Any other questions? Yes? Would you like to mention it? Okay. This is Dr. Lisa Levin, my advisor at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography.
It's probably worth mentioning that although ocean deoxygenation is only now getting recognition, the IOC, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, has deemed it important enough to form GON, Global Ocean Oxygen Network, to help raise awareness. And if people are, and it will be, we will, as an organization, that network will be producing a lot of materials that can be used for teaching, for raising awareness among politicians and so on. And so I would, they're not all up yet, but go to the IOC website and look up Global Ocean Oxygen Network. You can get them.
Any other questions? So next time when you're talking to your friends over coffee about climate change, someone asks you about what types of marine impacts are marine communities sustaining, we'll all say, well, the oceans are warming, they're becoming more acidic, and they're losing oxygen. Yeah? Because it's our responsibility to make sure we're communicating that message, both as scientists, as policymakers, as observers in this process. The only way we're going to get good action, good policy, is if we're all informed about what's happening. Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. One thing to note I forgot to mention earlier is we actually do have a side event from 1:30 to 2:30 today called Revolution Now and Beyond from the U.S. Department of Energy. We actually, I believe, also have a Hyperwall presentation between then and now. But can we thank our lovely Innovation Corner talk today? It was fascinating. And remember, go to state.gov/US Center or pick up a schedule for all activities here at the US Center for the rest of COP-22. And don't forget to please move your chairs back towards the center. Thank you.